Hey guys, welcome to the Remnant Radio. You're watching one of 19 episodes with Dr. Craig Keener, one of the preeminent Bible scholars on the planet, and we're talking about the Gospel of Mark.
This is going to be an exciting episode. The connections that Dr. Keener put together while we were with him at Asbury Seminary, phenomenal. But man, it was an expensive trip to get all of us out there to film this content. But we want to give it to you for free.
Well, we do want to give it to you for free, but one of the ways that you can help offset the cost for this is by purchasing our home group material. Dawson, our researcher, has put together this material. There's a leader's guide. There is a participant's guide. So you watch the video, you read the material, and then we walk you through. We have discussion questions that go along with it. Could be a huge blessing for you and your church.
Yeah, and this would be perfect for tons of different mediums. Maybe you're a pastor who's preaching through the Gospel of Mark, a home group leader, a Sunday school teacher. This would fit all of your needs. If you want to pick this up, there's a link in the description for the home group material. In addition to that, maybe you're out there and you don't lead any kind of group like that. Maybe you just want to contribute as a thank you to what we've put together here on Remnant. There's PayPal descriptions in the link of this video if you would like to support us.
So absolutely, click those links in the description, hit that subscribe button, and please enjoy this video with Dr. Craig Keener.
With that, let's dive into this chapter. We're talking about the parables. The very first thing that we see in the chapter is that Jesus goes out onto the water on a boat. What meaneth this?
In chapter 3, you see people pressing on him, crushing him. I mean, he was actually in physical duress because of this. He wanted to touch everybody, he wanted to heal everybody as much as he could, but of course the mission is paramount. And so, but what they end up doing, the whole area is by the lake anyway. Capernaum is by the lake. Tabgha, great fishing area, is right by the lake and not too far from Capernaum, and so on. So there's this cove near Capernaum, and if you push out just a little ways, the acoustics is perfect because somebody speaking from just a little way out, and this has been tested, they can be heard by somebody driving by on a car on the road that's now above that cove. On the hillside, and you actually, a little way out on the water, you can hear the conversations of people driving by on the road. So really good acoustics there. And it's also interesting that the site is such that you can see a lot of the visual imagery that Jesus uses in these parables. So the weeds, of course, that's not too surprising, but the thorns and sowers could be sowing there, and mustard seed, the yellow flowers of mustard plants. So all of these would be visible from there, and Jesus can just be giving visual illustrations, maybe even pointing as he's speaking.
So he goes into one of the first parables we see in Mark. Why does he teach in parables? Is that sort of normative for first century?
Yeah, pedagogically speaking, and I mean in terms of how you teach, that was a pretty standard way of teaching. Robert M. Johnston did a 600-page dissertation on Jesus' parables and the parables of the early rabbis, and showed a whole lot of parallels in a lot of respects, like they used story parables, but also a number of contrasts. Like they tended to support the status quo, whereas Jesus tends to challenge that. That's not surprising because they were part of the status quo by that point where they're giving the parables. Also, his are more eschatological, more oriented toward a future kingdom, which is also not too surprising because by the time these rabbis are speaking, there's been a big disappointment with a fake Messiah who led them into a war and got them in all sorts of trouble. And so some parallels, some differences. The same stock images, although they tend to use royal courts more than Jesus. He uses those sometimes. And Jesus' parables tend to use more agrarian images because he's speaking to peasants, rural farmers who were usually fairly poor. So it's a pedagogical technique. They didn't have PowerPoint. They didn't have Remnant radio. So what they had to work with was generating physical images through sometimes graphic stories, and sometimes just things people were familiar with. But there's also another reason I think that he teaches in parables, parables are really good means of communicating something in a way, in a narrative way. So you have prophets in the Old Testament telling parables. The Hebrew word that's most often translated parabole or parable is mashal, and it covers the whole range of the kind of forms that Jesus used when he was teaching. Sometimes very short similes, sometimes full story parables. I mean, you have Judges chapter 9, where one of Gideon's surviving sons tells a fable. Actually, it's not called a mashal there, but it's a fable that uses plants. The Bible's first veggie tale, you could say. Jesus tells a few of those, and then, but then you have others in the Old Testament, like the prophets, like when Nathan tells David a parable, and David gets the point of the parable and says, "That man should die," and that's when Nathan hits him with, "I'm talking about you, King David." So that was 2 Samuel 12, but also you have Isaiah using a parable. Actually, the prophets often used mashalim or parables. Ezekiel uses a lot of them, but Isaiah uses one in Isaiah 5, parable of the vineyard, that is kind of the basis. Jesus adapts it for his own setting in Mark chapter 12. So, yeah, there was plenty of precedent for prophets using it, and it was expected for sages.
But okay, so you got books like Exodus, Leviticus that are like, do this, do this, do this, do this. And then you have Jesus shows up and he's like, he speaks in these kind of cloaked ways. Why does he choose to speak in parables rather than just speaking directly like Exodus and Leviticus?
Sometimes sages used riddles to provoke thought. And Jesus certainly speaks in a lot of riddles. In fact, I think Mark adapts this technique himself. I mean, the book of Mark ends in a riddle, and Jesus is keeping a lot of things secret, though. Fairly secret. I mean, he can't keep everything secret, and even when he tells people to keep things secret, they don't. But, sometimes he's confronted with the need in public, and so he has to address it publicly. The guy let down through the roof. I mean, what are you going to do? Come back later, and then when people notice you're healed, they won't know I did it. Which isn't going to work. I mean, they already let him down through the roof. So some things he can't do privately. But in terms of his teaching, he says, he gives these parables, and it's like, okay, you have a sermon illustration, and that's really good. It helps people understand the point of the sermon. They get into the story. But what happens if you tell the story, you give the illustration, and there's no sermon to go with it? Well, some things are kind of self-evident from the context, but others, if there's no explanation, people are going to go away scratching their heads. Now, I like his healings, but these riddles are really hard. You think it means this, you think it means that. And the only people who would get it were the insiders. It's not just the 12, but the disciples. That is, whoever hung around afterwards, the people who showed up for midweek Bible study or read the Bible on their own. They didn't just show up for church on Sunday when it was a popular thing to do. So Jesus teaches in parables, and you notice what he says in verses 11 and 12. He says, those who are outside, they get all these things in parables in order that seeing, and he's quoting from Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah is also speaking ironically, but seeing that they may see, and hearing they may hear, and their hearts just become dull and hardened, lest they should understand it and be converted and healed. So the parables are so that those who are outside won't understand. But notice that later in this same chapter, he says there's nothing hidden except in order that it be revealed. So it was hidden for the present for the sake of ultimate revelation. Of course, the full revelation you get in 13, 26, and 27 when the Son of Man is revealed from heaven. But also it's revealed when Jesus rises from the dead. 9:9, don't tell anybody these things until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. Because until the cross and the resurrection, people couldn't really understand his mission. He's the Messiah. It takes him the first half of the gospel before Peter says, "Oh, you're the Messiah." Everybody's saying, "What kind of guy is this?" But then immediately after that, Jesus begins giving passion predictions, saying, "This is the kind of Messiah I'm going to be." And Peter's not up for that yet. So the rest of the gospel is saying, "Okay, this is the road to the cross. This is what it means for me to be the Messiah." And they weren't ready for that. So it's hidden in that sense, in order that in time it could be revealed. The mystery of the kingdom is the mystery of who the king is. And so now we can proclaim that mystery in terms of, we proclaim the kingdom of God, the reign of God, and we say Jesus is Lord. It's the same gospel, same good news, but we have a fuller, more explicit expression of that now that Jesus is risen.
You mentioned David. The prophet goes to David, and it sounds like at the beginning of the story, the prophet is talking to David, like the prophet is teaching David, but he doesn't realize the parable is not something to him, but it's about him. Right. Is it possible that Jesus isn't teaching to the audience? He's actually talking about the audience. Like, I'm actually casting out some words here. Some of you folk are really receiving this word, and you think that you're going to stick to the end, but persecution's going to rise, and you're going to get scorched.
Yeah, is it like prophetic in the same sense that David's parable or Nathan's parable was?
Yeah.
It's very applicable to the first century audience.
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, the examples of the different kinds of soils it gives are, definitely different kinds of soils in Galilee, and the farmers would be nodding, but they'd still be wondering, why is he telling us this? This isn't a lesson on agriculture that we don't know about. So you have some where it goes in one ear and out the other, and that's like the seed that's sown, and the birds come peck it up. Now there's different opinions on whether they plowed before they sowed, or they sowed before they plowed. We actually have conflicting evidence from antiquity, because sometimes they did it one way, sometimes they did it the other, and probably often they did it both, plowing before and after. But not all the seed is going to go where it's supposed to go. And so birds could come and peck it up. And just like today in my wife's garden, birds will come and pick stuff that they're not supposed to as far as the planters are concerned. The book of Jubilees, is it 11, talks about that, with Abraham having to fight off these birds, and they're sent by Mastema, Satan. Well, here they symbolize Satan snatching the word from people's hearts. Not that Satan is omnipresent, but just like in chapter 3, Satan functions as a metonymy for his kingdom. Jesus is casting out Satan. So every time he casts out a demon, he's casting out the kingdom of Satan. So in the same way, Satan's realm is snatching this from people's hearts. And before they can even pay attention, that might be people like some of Jesus' elite hearers who don't want to pay attention. And then maybe some other people who are just listening and not really listening. But then you also have the seed sown where it starts bearing fruit with joy, starts growing up with joy, but the thorns choke it out. And he says these thorns are like riches and the cares of this life. And that would be people like the rich ruler in Mark chapter 10. And then you have the rocky soil, where there's just a thin layer of soil over the rock, and so the roots can't really get down and support it. So these spring up with joy, but they don't last. And Jesus says those are the ones who fall away when persecution comes. Well, look at the disciples, Mark 14:50, and then the one guy in 51 and 52, the really graphic one, who is willing to let go of his nice linen cloak and run away naked just to get away. So the disciples, they're all saying, we abandoned everything and followed you. The same word for abandoned there is used for them abandoning Jesus. And even the women who are showing up most heroic in the Passion narrative, It's the same word. They fled him in 16:8. So when persecution comes, so it wasn't persecution for the women in 16:8, but when persecution comes, they fall away, and Peter is key example of that. I think this is from his own testimony. He follows even in the inner court, but then somebody corners him and says, "You also were with him. You also were his disciple." I wasn't with him. I'm not his disciple. Oh well, maybe you're not. But he's the rock. Supposed to be steadfast, or maybe he's rocky soil. Although he does get restored afterwards by the Lord's great grace.
So a little bit of plowing before, a little bit afterward.
yeah. But then you have the good soil. In Judea, probably the good soil, the average yield would be maybe 10.5-fold, something like that, or 7.5-fold. But this is 30, 60, and 100-fold. Really good yield. So, yeah, it's like what happens when you sow seed. Not all of it is going to bear fruit. But in the end, it's better that you sowed it because you're going to get more back than what you sowed. And that's a good lesson for us with the kingdom. And you see that, Jesus is the sower here who's sowing, but it's a principle, and you see it also in the next parable in 4:26-29, where Jesus sows, where somebody sows, and, normally, like you're a gardener, and my wife's a gardener, when you sow, normally you invest something in it, you do some work, but this guy, he just puts the seed in the ground, and then God does all the rest. One plants, one waters, God gives the increase. And that's a principle for us as well, that we sow, we're not responsible for the harvest. God will give the harvest. We just need to be faithful in sowing.
So then there's 3 parables about seeds in this one chapter, and the third parable on a seed is the mustard seed. Why did he choose that one? I know you mentioned that there's mustard plants all around. What's the meaning of that one?
Well, he's probably, because he's contrasting the size, he speaks of the smallest of all seeds. He's probably speaking of Brassica nigra, the black mustard seed. It's the smallest of the mustard seeds. You can just fit a whole mess of them in your hand. In fact, one calculation, if it's correct, you can get about 20,000 of them per ounce. So they're very small. There is a smaller kind of seed, an orchid seed, known today, but it was too small to be visible to the human eye. They wouldn't have known that there was anything smaller. So, pedagogically, in terms of Jesus' teaching, it makes sense. The mustard seed is the smallest seed, and yet it grows into this huge bush, sometimes averaging like 5 feet high. That may not sound like a massive tree like in Matthew and Luke, but it's large enough for the birds to perch in it, which probably adapts some imagery from the Old Testament, where you have these trees that symbolize kingdoms. I think Ezekiel 17 maybe for God's kingdom or somebody's kingdom. Daniel chapter 4, you've got these different kingdoms, and Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is like a tree that the birds come and build their nests in its branches. Well, this is a parable about the kingdom of God, that God's kingdom, it comes in a way that's obscure as far as the world's concerned. Like Jesus is going around in obscure Galilee, primarily in rural areas. We don't have him visiting Sepphoris or Tiberias. We don't know if he visited the third largest, Magdala, although Mary Magdalene became his disciple. And, it's obscure in the eyes of the mighty Roman Empire. Until he gets to Jerusalem, he's almost a non-issue for much of the, many of the elites of the world. But today we have, there are hundreds of millions of people who name the name of Christ.
I think it's kind of contrary to what we see in the world today when we talk about, we need to get into these spheres of influence and have an impact.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that flies in the face of that kind of thinking.
You're right. I shouldn't be seeking an impact by being on Remnant
There
Radio.
you go.
Yeah.
You get out of here. Hey, help us understand the word pedagogy. There's a lot of people watching that are like,
Yeah.
big word.
Yes, pedagogy just is like educational technique.
Excellent. Okay, so we're working our way through the parables. Quite a few parables here that we're gleaning from. There's a saying here in, was it 11? You've got the secret. But then here in 24, he's like, be careful how you hear. Why is that important? That you have the secret, but also because I think if I'm putting myself in the disciples' shoes, why is it important that I be careful how I listen? You've already told me the answer. And I feel like as the reader, I'm reading through the book of Mark. Jesus is giving me the answer to what this is. So I get to be the insider. I get to be like the disciple. Why is it important that I'm careful about the way I hear if I've already been given the secret?
But he gives you the answer, Mark does, to one of the parables, but he doesn't explain the others.
Mm-hmm.
Does that relate as well?
I think so. Although with the answer to the one, when he gives the answer to that one, he says, you don't understand this parable? How will you understand all the parables? So it's kind of the key to understanding the rest of the parables. And in that sense, what it's doing, it's saying, okay, you have to hear and you have to persevere in hearing. And you have to be part of this inner circle where you press in and listen to the interpretations. And so they do press in and get the interpretations. What about us? Well, if you really want to hear it, then you've got to press in and get the interpretation. He doesn't give the reader all the interpretations because we too have to press in. So they do function as riddles in that sense. Now, some scholars have said, and this was more in the past than today because it's been pretty adequately refuted, but some scholars during a lot of the 20th century were saying that interpretations to parables, those are made up by the later church because Jesus wouldn't have given interpretations. That is really nonsense. Sorry, you need to be respectful, but
tell us what you really think about this form of textual criticism.
like Robert Johnston pointed out, and Klein Snodgrass and a lot of other parable scholars have shown, and actually, just going back and looking at Jewish parables in general from the time, David Stern's work on parables in Midrash, rabbinic parables normally had interpretations that went with them. So what's unusual is that Jesus doesn't give all his interpretations publicly. Not that he does give interpretations, but rabbis also had some secret teachings, and of course Qumran and others did the same. But now getting back to your question about he tells them to hear even after he's given them the explanation. It's one thing to hear, but remember it can go in one ear and out the other. It's another thing to hear and understand. And yet it's another thing to hear and understand and really take heed, because we have to be like the good soil. We have to persevere to the end. Calvinists and Arminians, they disagree on whether the person was saved to begin with or not, but they both agree that you have to persevere to the end. Amen. If you're really going to be a disciple. And that's part of the message in Mark's gospel.
So Mark 1, he's Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, right? So we see one of the themes that we talked about in our intro is that there are these identity, who is this kind of theme, and he's exercising his authority. He's displaying who he is through his authority. And those are two themes that we've been tracking throughout this book, and we're coming to the calming of the storm. And in this section, we see both of those kinds of narratives playing out. We've seen Jesus exercise his authority in teaching, and they're like, wow, this guy's got authority. And he's casting out demons. He's got authority over the demons. He's got authority over sickness, and how he's about to display his authority over nature. Introduce us into that story of, I guess, when Jesus calms the sea. The story seems to have some Old Testament parallels to it. It's kind of a rich text.
Yeah, there are actually a lot of Old Testament passages about Yahweh ruling over the sea and calming the wind in the sea. And by the way, the way the storm is described, this may not be what we think of as like a thunderstorm. It's just probably a windstorm. But a windstorm that could capsize a boat, and these would come up suddenly on the Lake of Galilee. So it's the wind and the sea that he has to calm. But you notice that Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat, on the stern. There was a place kind of underneath the stern where things could be stored, and you could have the pilot's cushion there, and Jesus can lay his head there. When Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head except maybe on the stern of a boat, but it was also elevated.
So he didn't just float around when he took naps. He just laid down and hovered. That's not what that meant.
But
He hovered over the water.
It was elevated stern. So I mean, he was not getting as wet as the others were, and he was able to sleep. But also the sleeping, you see how he's been running all this time. People have been pressing him. His fishermen disciples are taking care of the boat, but he's the one who's teaching this whole time. So he's dead tired. Mm-hmm. And the Psalms also speak of being able to sleep in the midst of trouble because of trust in the Lord. So Jesus exemplifies that. But you also have a contrast, because there was this prophet in the Old Testament by the name of Jonah. And Jonah was asleep in the hold of a ship when the Lord sent a storm, and everybody's crying out to God. And then they wake up Jonah and they say, cry out to your God. Don't you care that the rest of us are perishing? And
he's like, no.
Yeah,
he didn't
just
care.
so long as I perish, it's fine.
Yeah.
But finally he says, throw me overboard, and then he gives a big fish a case of indigestion, and he really doesn't want to go to Nineveh. But the Lord can be very persuasive.
Well, so just like you see in Jonah's story, you've got the other guys on the boat. They're coming to him like, hey, don't you care? Pray to your God. And the same thing's happening with the disciples. Mm-hmm. And they ask him the question, hey, don't you care? We're going to perish.
Yeah.
Why did they ask him this?
Well, Jesus is not Jonah. And so it's going to go a different direction from here on out. But it's not wrong for them to say something like that. I mean, in the Psalms, you have people pleading with God, don't you care? Awake, O Lord, arise to defend us. So that's not too surprising. But still, they should know that this boat is not going to go down with Jesus in it. They should have seen enough about Jesus already to know that God has a plan that's not going to be overturned by the wind and the waves.
Yeah, I mean, is there a parallel? Because I know this is not in our questions. I'm going to toss it in there. You tell me if we don't have time for it. Is there a parallelism that Jonah is supposed to be going to Nineveh and there's a storm? He's supposed to go to Gentiles, and Jesus is about to hit the other side of the sea, and he go meet some pig farmers on the other side of there. Those are not Jewish kosher people. Parallelism, probably.
That's very possible. Yes.
Interesting. Okay, so in this text, which a few more minutes. Sorry, I'm pulling it out. So in this text, they're like, hey, they have a legitimate fear. They'd seen, I'm sure it's like ice road truckers, like that was their occupation. The Sea of Galilee, tipped over boats. They'd probably had friends of theirs whose dads didn't come back. Like it was a legitimate fear. People are really going to die. But then Jesus responds to them, "Where's your faith?" Mm-hmm. Why? I mean, it seems kind of like a harsh response. If we're going to be realist, if we're in the disciples' position, I mean, they probably came out looking like they had mountains of faith compared to me still. But why his response? Where's your faith?
Yeah, because most of us have been crying out to the Lord in different situations.
For way less. Yeah.
And so when he says, where is your faith? There's a lot about faith in this section of Mark. You already see the faith of those who let the paralyzed man down through the roof in 2:5, or 2:4 and 5. 5 is where the faith is commented on. 5:34 and 36. Also, you see the faith commended of the woman with the flow of blood, who formerly had the flow of blood by the time her faith is commended. 5:36. Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. So there's an emphasis on that in this section and elsewhere in Mark as well. Commentators tend to highlight it in this section. But also you have some scholars think, well, it's just that how could you believe the boat was going to go down with Jesus in it? And then other scholars have suggested, well, look, Jesus has already called these disciples to be with him and then cast out demons and do the kind of works that he does. And then later in the gospel, he actually sends them out to multiply his work, and they're supposed to. He's delegating authority to them, so they're supposed to carry these things out, and they're supposed to be able to. They find out in chapter 11, you're supposed to be able to command mountains to be removed, and they'll be removed. So some scholars think that he's actually saying, why did you wake me up? Why didn't you calm the storm? And I think that's very possible in light of that theme in Mark. The problem with it is it seems like it's kind of early in Mark to have that level of expectation for them. So I'm not really committed on that question specifically.
When he hasn't given them any indication so far in Mark's narrative that they're going to be doing these same things, other than maybe calling them his disciples?
Well, no. Back in chapter 3, to be with him, and they'll have authority over demons and stuff. But But then some people think that the storm is related to demons. He's going to an area where you've got these really strong spiritual powers, a whole legion of demons right there on the coast of the Decapolis. And some people think that the wind and the waves are related to that. But then they appeal to like really distant parallels, like Mesopotamian parallels where you have storm demons and stuff like that. But in Greek mythology, they tended to be more like deities. And in Jewish thought, they were angels. So I'm not sure. The background doesn't necessarily fit. But it is interesting when Jesus rebukes the wind and says, be silent. Well, elsewhere in Mark's gospel, he rebukes demons. He commands them to be silent, same wording. However, that wording is also used for non-demons. In both cases, both the rebuking and the being quiet. So it may just be that, and some people say, well, they have to be demons because they're personified. But when you say to this mountain, be removed, mountains don't have ears either. So it's just the reality that these things have to submit to the name of Jesus. When you get to chapter 6, the wind and the waves don't even wait for a command from Jesus. Once he gets into the boat, they calm.
Yeah, they already learned their lesson.
They learned their lesson, yeah.
They learned their lesson. They're watching sickness get its butt kicked, and they're like, no, we'll submit. I feel like this is a necessary pastoral question for people who are watching because, again, we talk about healing. Healing has to bow its name to Jesus. Demons have to bow its name to Jesus. Weather is bowing its name to Jesus. And then the disciples are expected to be able to do that as well. And you said, hey, the mountain should toss itself into the sea. I think of only God, can calm the seas. There's passages in the Psalm that seem to speak of that. Mm-hmm. When we talk about, like I go to Denver and there's a mountain, can I just talk to it and just expect that I have authority to physically move that mountain? Or is it faith in the mission of God, faith in what Christ is doing, and then when there is something like a mountain or like a storm that is in opposition that I can expect? I don't just walk around with divine authority, right?
Don't touch my mountains.
Bro, I don't want to touch your mountains, bro. That's why I'm afraid that someone in Denver is going to start practicing this, and I want them to stay there.
Yeah. No, it's in the context of mission.
Okay.
And that's pretty clear in Mark's gospel.
Okay.
They're delegated. It's delegated authority to the extent of their mission.
I hope you've enjoyed that episode on the Gospel of Mark with Dr. Craig Keener. If you want to go back and watch former episodes that we've done, there's a playlist right here, or you can watch the very next chapter, which will be listed right here. If you've been blessed by this episode or other episodes we've done, consider giving. There are links in the description.